One of the kind of totemic images of the energy transition is that image of the falling price of generating electricity from wind and solar. And my argument is that actually there are still pretty significant economic obstacles. Absolutely, people know this is an issue, but they find it hard to talk about it because people don't like them talking about it.
Brett, welcome to The Breakdown.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be with you.
How are you doing on this rainy day in London?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's good to be back in London. I'm always happy to be here, and it's nice to be with you.
Yeah, and on a whirlwind press tour for your latest book.
Sort of. I wouldn't put it in such grandiose terms, but trying to do a few talks here and there. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm really looking forward to sort of unpacking that book with you. The Price is Wrong for everybody listening, and the kind of thrust of the book is that markets or capitalism more broadly aren't going to deliver the transition that we need in the energy system. That's a very simplified way of putting it, and we'll break down, I think, the nuts and bolts of that. But I think energy is such an interesting topic for me because it's so important to what we need to do, but it's not particularly sexy, I think, to a lot of people.
No, that's true as well.
So could you start by setting the scene for us of just how important the energy system is to decarbonizing?
Yeah, that's far and away the best place to start, because the obvious. So it's a book essentially about electricity, the power sector. So the obvious question is like, why write about the power sector in the climate context? And so the way I like to think about this is kind of it's like the old Venn diagrams that you learned about in school. And so if you think about the biggest circle, the outside circle, as being like total greenhouse gas emissions, then the biggest circle that comes within that is emissions of carbon dioxide, which is roughly about 75%, somewhere in the order of that, of total greenhouse gas emissions. And then if you look at that circle, that 75%, then roughly 75% of that is from the combustion of fossil fuels, so gas, oil, and coal. So the other 25% is kind of like land use change and deforestation and that sort of thing. So if we focus in on that 75%, which is the core of the problem, as most people understand, is the combustion of fossil fuels, then the single biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions is electricity generation. I think it's somewhere around 40, maybe slightly more percent of that. And then you have other things like transportation, industrial processes, buildings and that kind of stuff, and heat generation. But electricity is kind of the heart of the problem. And so the first reason for focusing on it is that that's the core of the climate problem as it currently is. But then there's an almost more important reason for understanding the power sector and the issues around power sector decarbonisation, which is that, as I'm sure many people will know, the way that the world is going about trying to decarbonise lots of those other things, not least transportation, but not only transportation, is precisely through electrification. So the idea there is that, so take, for example, road transportation, that if you have cars and trucks running on internal combustion engines that are burning gasoline, there's different ways you could decarbonise that. You could switch them to some other form of fuel, like a biofuel or something, or you can put batteries in them and charge those batteries through electricity. And very broadly speaking, that latter strategy is the principal way in which the world is going about decarbonisation more broadly. And so what that means is that the electricity sector, which is already very big and is already the main source of carbon dioxide emissions, is set to get much, much bigger, because electrification is the heart of how the world is going about decarbonisation more broadly. So it kind of means it's doubly important to decarbonise it, because if you don't decarbonise it, it's going to be even more at the centre of the problem than it already is.
And I guess we think often of electricity actually, I should say that we often don't really think about electricity as
No, we
all
don't.
in terms of how
No.
it actually sort of physically gets to where we are. I just kind of flick on my light switch and it's there. So another question that may sound a bit basic to you, but could you just unpack for us, how does electricity get from point A, a wind turbine in Scotland, to me in my flat? And who are the kind of actors and entities involved in that process?
Right. Yeah. So I think the best way to approach that is to think. So one kind of metaphor that people often use to think about the electricity delivery system, which in its totality is often referred to as the grid, is that you have kind of highways where traffic goes very, very fast, and then you have kind of lesser roads coming off the highways. And so the highways are what is referred to as the transmission system, which is where electricity is transported over very large distances at very high voltage. The length and breadth of the country, whichever country you're talking about, and then you have kind of the local trunk roads that then distribute it from those highways to where it's consumed, whether that's household consumption or industrial consumption, and that's typically referred to as the distribution system. And the voltage is stepped down when you go from the transmission system to the distribution system, and then like the wind farms you were talking about, there are substations that connect local sources of generation to the transmission system. So it's kind of like a highway network and road network, essentially. So that's the first thing to say. That's what it, in very, very simplistic terms, looks like in an engineering sense. And in terms of like who controls and manages that and how it's kind of structured economically, I think the most important thing to understand is that large parts of the world, for reasons that we can get into, have in recent decades gone through a considerable process of transformation in how the industry that manages all of this is structured. And so if you go back to kind of the post-war era, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the norm in most places of the world, and of course there were exceptions, but the norm would have been that within any territorial unit, which in the case of the UK would be the country as a whole, or at least England, but in somewhere like the US would be at a regional level, you would essentially have one actor that controlled everything about that system. So it controlled generation, it controlled transmission, distribution, and the relationship with the customers. So it was what was referred to as a vertically integrated entity. It's integrated across the verticality of the supply chain, and in many parts of the world, including the UK, that entity would have been a public sector actor. So in the UK case, it was the Central Electricity Generating Board. In the US case, many of those actors were private, but many of them were public as well. And then for all sorts of reasons that, as I say, we can get into if we want to, from the 80s onwards, that whole mode of organisation was essentially dismantled in large parts of the world. And the key part of that was that kind of vertical integration was unbundled, to use the language that's typically used, and it was kind of broken up so that you moved towards a system where you had separate entities involved at different parts of the process. So you would have companies that do just generation, you would have another entity that controlled the transmission network, another entity that controlled the local distribution networks, or other entities, and then you would have other entities still that controlled the relationship with the customer. So they were essentially retailers or resellers of the electricity. And so that's the situation in which many countries are at today. And those are typically referred to as liberalized electricity markets. But there are many parts of the world where markets have not been liberalized, and they still have that kind of, to one degree or another, that traditional system. And the US is a really interesting case because it has both. So there are, I think it's roughly around 2/3 of the country by population has been restructured along those lines. So it's been vertically disintegrated. And Texas is a great example of that, is often the example that people use. But there are other parts of the country where you still have local, regulated, vertically integrated monopolies that control everything. And Florida is often invoked as the kind of prime example of that, but the Southeast more generally. So that's a very kind of whirlwind overview of both the physicality and the business side of how the electricity system works.
And at the center of all of that is a market, right, to set prices for electricity. So I guess I know it's different everywhere in the world, so picking the UK as an example. Yes. How do all of these sort of actors interact to then arrive at, the price of electricity that we as a user see?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess that a good place to start with that is to think about what we're paying for when we pay our electricity bill, whether we are a household or an industrial user. And obviously we don't often think about that. We just pay the bill or try to pay the bill if we can. But essentially we're paying for two things. We're paying for electricity to be produced, to be generated, but we're also paying for it to be distributed from the places of its generation to where we live. And to take that latter aspect of it, because it's very, very important, not least with respect to renewables, the grid operator is essentially, if you think about the totality of the costs that are involved in maintaining, controlling, upgrading, operating the grid, they are kind of spread across all of the actors that are connected in one way or another and dependent on the grid, both the generators who are producing the electricity and the consumers. So on the consumption side, we are paying, as I said, partly for the generators to produce electricity, but partly our share of the costs of the grid being maintained and upgraded and so on. So the basic, and so it's important to keep that in mind, and I'm sure we'll come back to the importance of that. In terms of how all the actors interact, as you said, the shift historically has been more towards markets, where supply and demand theoretically at least meet in a kind of marketplace, and price is set by the relationship between supply and demand. Whereas historically, and still in those unrestructured places like Florida that I talked about, you have regulators that essentially set the prices. But in places like the UK, the example you mentioned, it's much more based on markets, which is not to say that policymakers don't get involved and intervene in the price mechanism. Sometimes they absolutely do, and the energy crisis of 2021 to 22 was a great example of that. But in general, it's markets. And the key thing to understand is that there are essentially two types of markets that it's important for people to understand. So the first is what's referred to as the wholesale market. And essentially what that is that's the place, it's not a physical place, but the virtual place where two sets of actors primarily meet. So the first of those is the generators, who are selling their output. And the second is the companies that essentially buy that electricity and then sell it to us. So they're essentially intermediaries. And so, for example, if you're in the UK, if your electricity company that you're buying your electricity from is, say, Octopus Energy, Octopus is one of those companies that will be buying power on the wholesale market from generators. So that's the wholesale market. Then there's the retail market, which is the next bit, which is where the octopuses of the world meet us and meet industrial consumers. And so essentially those retailers or resellers, whatever you want to call them, they buy power on the wholesale market and sell it on the retail market to us. So they're classic intermediaries. So that's essentially how it works. But there's lots of complexity to it. One of the complexities is kind of like the question of what's being sold on the wholesale market. And what I mean by that is are people buying and selling electricity for sale today, tomorrow, 6 months in the future? You can do all of those different things on the wholesale market. You can sell electricity of different forms in that sense. that's one thing to understand. The other thing that's to understand, which is very, very important and very topical right now, is that the entities we've been talking about can in many cases kind of circumvent that market. And what I mean by that is, say if you are a generating company that's selling electricity, you don't necessarily just have to sell it on the wholesale market. What you could do is you could enter a market. It's still a market relationship, but it's a direct market relationship with a major industrial or commercial consumer of electricity. And this has been in the news a lot recently with relation to big IT companies like the Amazons and the Microsoft and the Googles. So what they'll often do is they'll just avoid the wholesale market and the retail market, and they'll go straight to an electricity generating company, and they'll say, you know what, we'll buy your power directly from you. If you're, say, a wind farm, we'll take all of the power that you produce for the next 12 years and we'll pay you a fixed price for that electricity. And the generator will often be like, okay, well, that's great. Then I can avoid all the hassle of selling on the wholesale market. So you just have everything that comes in the middle kind of gets disintermediated, to use a horribly technical word. And so you have these direct relationships between the end consumer and the generating company. But in general, it's these wholesale and retail markets that are important to understand.
And can we pick up on something you mentioned there, which is the kind of energy crisis more broadly, that all of us experienced over the past couple of years? And how, I think one of the things that I often heard people say during that, and it was a crisis related to the price of gas, and you'd often hear people say, well, don't we have all this renewable energy now? Isn't that supposed to cut our bills because it has low operating costs? Why isn't that happening? And can you explain how the functioning of the wholesale market contributed to that?
So this is something that was obviously much in the news, not particularly in Europe, not only in Europe in 21, 22, and it kind of brought to light a set of really important issues about how these markets work, and not least around how electricity is priced, that were completely new to most people. And people were like, well, as you said, people were like, what the heck is going on here? And it didn't appear to make much sense. And in many ways, it doesn't make much sense. And then as soon as the crisis abated, people kind of forgot about it again. And so you don't. And so, but there was this fascinating period when everyone became kind of quasi-experts on electricity pricing. So the reason that happened was to do with the way in which electricity is typically priced in the wholesale market, and so it's really interesting to understand essentially how that process works. So basically, what happens is that electricity is kind of bought and sold primarily on a day-ahead basis, and so what that means is, like, for a particular. So say today it's, what day is today? Wednesday. Sorry, I lose track. So today is Wednesday. So let's say we're focusing on the period between midday and 1 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, Thursday afternoon. What will happen is that, so the grid operator, which in the UK case is the national grid, its concern is that there will be exactly the right amount of power being produced and sold onto the grid in that 1 hour period to match its expectations for the amount of demand. So supply and demand on the grid have to match at all times, otherwise you've got real problems. And so the way that works is that if say you are an electricity generating company, what you will do is you will make a bid for that hour period, and you'll say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Grid Operator, I'm going to be able to produce a certain number of megawatts per hour for that hour period, and I'm going to bid a particular price for that, and that, obviously the price that you bid will depend on all sorts of different considerations. If you are a conventional power plant selling that's working by burning coal, or in the UK case principally natural gas, it will be heavily influenced by the price of the fuel, and we'll come back to that. If you're a renewable company, it's a totally different consideration because you have no fuel costs. So you will say, okay, I can produce that much, and it's going to cost you. I'm going to sell it at this price, and And of course, in the case of renewables, there's a certain uncertainty there because you never quite know. And so on the day itself, there's all these adjustments that are made. But forget that for now. It's not important for now. And what the grid operator does is it takes all the bids for that hour period and say it needs for that period, let's say 1,000 megawatts in total. It basically starts with the cheapest bid and then it stacks them up until it gets enough bids to supply the total demand, okay? And then once it's got that, then it says to all the more expensive generators whose bids are above that price, it's like, we don't need your power. So it takes all the ones that are sufficient from the cheapest up to supply the total amount of electricity. Okay, that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is how much those generators are paid. And the key thing to understand is they are not, in almost all cases, they are not paid the amount that they bid. What the electricity price is the price that was bid by the last and most expensive generator that was necessary to be accepted to meet that overall demand. So say there are 10 generators and one bids £1 and the other bids 2, 3, 4, up to 10. If the most expensive one is £10 that's necessary, everyone gets paid that £10, irrespective of they bid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? So that's the most important thing to say. It's the market clearing price. Everyone gets the same price. And the theory is that, well, they're all supplying electricity, right? So they should all be paid the same price. And there's lots of suggestions that we need to reform the market and people should be paid price as they bid. Maybe, but that's not the reality. Everyone's paid that £10. So go back to 2021, 22. What the issue was that suddenly the price of gas, not least because of what happened with Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and problems with sourcing gas, was that gas prices suddenly really spiked. And what that meant was that in the electricity market, on those days and at those times of day when the grid operator needed to get gas plants fired up in order to meet total demand, suddenly the price of that last unit was like 20 times higher than it had been a week or a month before that. And everyone was being paid that price. Whereas when demand was low, on days when demand was low and it was really windy, they didn't have to switch on the gas turbines. And so the price of electricity was really, really cheap. But at those times when gas generators were required to meet total demand, the gas price was setting the electricity price because it was the so-called marginal producer. It was the last producer required to meet total demand. And so I think the data said that, like in 21 or 22, something like this, gas only provided maybe 20 to 30% of total UK electricity, but it set the market price like 70% of the time, right? So that's how to understand it. And then since the crisis, the price of gas has fallen back, so electricity prices have fallen back. So there's this what people refer to as the coupling of electricity and gas prices. And everyone was like, we need to decouple electricity and gas prices. And then everyone promptly forgot about it at the end of the crisis.
As they tend to do.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was incredibly clear. I think we've all just had a kind of crash course, sort of electricity 101. So thank you. That was incredibly clarifying. Now that we're equipped with all of that brilliant knowledge, I want to turn to the main arguments that you make in your book about the role of markets and the forces of capitalism in decarbonization. And I think what's so interesting is the argument that you make contravenes so much of what, any of us who might follow climate or energy policy in the news see, which is often, wow, look at this really steep graph of renewable energy. It looks great and it's all being built out so quickly and the price is, falling off precipitously. So the cost of building renewables and of renewable energy is now so much cheaper than fossil fuels. We're all set. Yep. We're off to the races. Yes. And the point that you make is actually kind of precisely the opposite. It's kind of a very spicy, spicy take to throw into the mix.
And it seems counterintuitive.
It does. Yeah. So could you just unpack your sort of core thesis there for us and explain why the cost in your mind is really not the relevant factor?
Yeah, and it's interesting the way you articulate it because it does seem counterintuitive, and and that sense that we are off to the races, that one curve has been going sharply upwards, the other's been going sharply downwards. And it's been interesting. I mean, whether this is relevant or interesting or not, I don't know. But I'll say it. It's been interesting, the reaction I've gotten to the book, and from some quarters, not least those that have kind of bought into that argument very, very fervently, has been kind of almost violently negative. It's like, you can't be right, and not least it's come from entities that I would have thought of as might potentially being kind of allies. They don't want to hear it. They really do. It's like, no, this is sorted.
This is the one good thing we have.
Exactly.
Like, how dare you take this away from us?
No, that's completely right.
Yeah.
But I'll say that the emails I've had saying this have been prefaced with, we haven't read the book yet, but...
Classic.
Yeah.
Classic.
And so it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to talk to you then. That's a little bit of an exaggeration about not talking to them, but definitely it's been prefaced with those comments. Anyway, so yes, I mean, where to start to unpack this? First, I guess the first thing to say is to focus on the first of the graphs you mentioned, which is the graph curving steeply upwards. And I always like to say that I often think about that issue of progress in renewables generation as being a classic kind of glass half full, glass half empty issue. So if you're a glass half full person, you're like, well, look at this, is awesome. We are the amount of renewable energy capacity that we are installing is increasing rapidly, and the amount of electricity that we are generating from solar and wind is also increasing rapidly, and both of those things are true. Although I would say that there's a very interesting kind of geographical story there about where that's happening that we should definitely come back to, and particularly the role of China in this, and the fact that China accounts for much of that growth, and China has a very, very different model about how it's doing this. So you'd think that's a great story, and it kind of is. The glass half empty story says, okay, well, that's all well and good, but let's look at another graph as well, which is the graph of electricity generation from fossil fuels, which is also still going up. So despite the fact that for several years now people have been saying this is the year that electricity generation from burning coal and natural gas, there's a little bit of oil, but it's basically coal and natural gas, this is the year that it will peak. People said that in 21, 22, 23, and it still hasn't happened. 2024 might be the year that it peaks and we then begin the process of decline. But even if it is, if the decline is only very, very slow, we're still failing because it has to be very, very sharp. But be that as it may, it's still going up. So electricity generation from fossil fuels increased again in 2023, and as therefore did carbon dioxide emissions from electricity generation. So to my mind, it's impossible to say that we are succeeding in any shape or form while that is still increasing. Still increasing, 20, 25 years after we really began to try to deal with that issue of power sector emissions. So that's the first graph. The second graph, as you mentioned, is that there is one of the kind of totemic images of commentary on the energy transition is that image of the falling price of generating electricity from wind and solar. And you're right that if you go back 20 years or so and you looked at those graphs, and what those graphs show is the technical terminology is the levelized cost of energy or the levelized cost of electricity. And basically what that tries to show is the average cost over the lifetime of a generating facility of producing, on average, a unit of electrical power. And if you go back 20 years, it was much more expensive in the case of solar and wind to generate electricity than by burning coal or natural gas, and even more expensive probably than nuclear. And then over time, what happened was that as investment in those technologies ramped up and you had economies of scale being generated and you had greater production efficiencies, the cost of those technologies, they became much more efficient, and the cost of generating electricity from wind and solar fell sharply. And by the kind of mid-2010s, there were lots of data points suggesting that, as you said, it had to become cheap, and often in some places cheaper to generate electricity renewably than from coal and natural gas. And as you say, that was the point at which people said, now we're off to the races. It was a great way of putting it. And you're right to say it's that argument that my book throws some kind of cold water on. Obviously not because I don't want the renewables story to be a good one, and not because I don't want renewables growth to surge ahead. That's exactly what I want. But my argument is that actually there are still some pretty significant economic obstacles, and that focusing on that chart is actually quite misleading for a number of different reasons that we can get into. I think the only other thing, just before I do that it's important for people to understand about these economic obstacles associated with solar and wind is why that's important. And what I mean by that, so someone might say, well, why does it matter that there are these economic obstacles associated with solar and wind investment? You can do other things. You can rely on nuclear. You can have, community generation that does this, and profitability, for example, is not really relevant to them. So the reason that argument is important is that there are two very important things about the way in which the world is approaching decarbonisation of the power sector that make it important. And so very, very briefly, they are that the world is mainly focusing on solar and wind. So the book is about solar and wind, not because I necessarily think solar and wind is the one way ahead and it's better than nuclear or hydro or geothermal. The book focuses on solar and wind because solar and wind are the absolute core of the way in which the world is going about this. So yes, there are countries where a significant role is being assigned to nuclear. And yes, there are countries where there's significant geothermal potential and so on. But for the most part, we are betting the house on solar and wind. And all the projections from people like the International Energy Agency reinforce that fact. That's what we're relying on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, just as we are relying on solar and wind, we are also relying mainly on the private sector to do this. So governments, essentially what they are doing around the world, and yes, there are exceptions, and China's the great example of one of those exceptions. But for the most part, what governments are doing is they're saying, we are expecting you, the private sector, to do this. You are going to do this. That doesn't mean we're not going to do anything. We'll, regulate electricity markets. We'll provide various kind of means of subsidy and support to help nudge you in the right direction if you're not showing kind of necessary willingness or aptitude to do that. But we are not going to do it ourselves. And again, there are exceptions, but for the most part, governments are not developing and financing and owning and operating through publicly owned enterprises. They are relying on the private sector to do that. And that's why these economic questions are so important, because that's the core of the strategy. Yeah.
And if the cost is so low, the costs of, doing that generation, what makes those subsidies necessary? Why do we need to be nudging private actors into this? Isn't it sort of a great investment?
we'll get there. We're getting to that point. We're getting to that point in the argument. So the argument of the book is very straightforward. As you know from having read it, there's a lot of kind of wonky technical detail that helps reinforce and substantiate that argument. But the argument is really quite simple. And so the argument is that the business of renewables, and here it's very important to be clear that I'm not focusing on the kind of manufacturing. I'm not focusing on the production of the solar modules and the turbines, which is a big, important business, and it's much in the news at the moment with kind of issues around protectionism, relationship between China and the US and so on. But that's not what I'm focusing on. But it's connected to, obviously, the business I'm talking about, which is renewables deployment, developing wind and solar farms, owning and operating them, and selling the electricity that they generate. And sure, there are companies that do both of those things, but to the extent that it's analytically possible to separate them, that's what I'm talking about. So that business of renewables deployment and renewable electricity generation is a largely unappealing, maybe that's the wrong word, unattractive, problematic business from a profitability perspective. And of course, in capitalism, if you are a private sector actor, profitability is that's the thing that dictates what you do, profitability expectations. And so that's the main, and the argument has kind of two separate parts which are related, but I think analytically distinct. So one of those is that the profitability of that business is very, very volatile and very, very uncertain, and very, very and therefore very, very unpredictable. And so let's take a kind of an example of how this plays out in practice to see what that looks like and why it matters. So say you are a very earnest renewable energy developer. You're very keen to roll out as much wind power as you want to help save the planet. And lots of energy developers out there, that's precisely the types of actors they are, actually, which is an important point, which again, I'll come back to. So say you want to develop a wind farm, it's going to cost 200 million euros, for example, to buy the turbines, to buy or lease the land, to get your grid connection, all the rest of it, and get it up and running. The way you will normally do that, whether you're a big developer or a relatively small developer, is you will typically try to borrow a large part of the money to do that. It's typically financed 60 to 90% with debt. So you'll go to the bank and say, look, can you give me 150 million euros to help build this wind farm? And the bank, understandably, will say, yeah, I'd like to do that. ESG is my thing these days. I really, I want to help save the planet as well. So yes, I'm very keen to do this. How are you going to pay back that money, and how long is it going to take you to do that? And you'll say, well, I'm going to sell the electricity that I generate over the next 20 to 25 years, and that will help me to pay the interest and repay the debt. And the banker will say, well, okay, but what price are you going to sell the electricity at? And you'll say, I have no idea. And the reason you have no idea is that the price of electricity in those wholesale markets we talked about earlier, for some of the reasons we talked about earlier, is unbelievably volatile. I don't know of any commodity, any other product where the prices are so volatile, in particular during periods of energy crisis, but not only during periods of energy crisis. It can go from £50 per megawatt hour to £5,000 per megawatt hour in the space of an hour. Like if that marginal producer is 1 hour a wind developer, a wind generator, and the next hour a gas turbine, and the gas price has spiked. So it's incredibly volatile, and nobody, despite sometimes suggesting otherwise, can reliably predict electricity prices 3 weeks ahead, let alone 3 months or 3 years or 15 years ahead. And so the bank will say, well, okay, I can see that if you were able to sell your electricity on average at £50 per megawatt hour for the next 12 years, you'll have no problem repaying the interest making the interest payments and repaying the debt. But if you sell it on average at £25 per megawatt hour, there's no way you're going to be able to make the interest payments or repay the debt. And that's the reality, is that you don't know. And so they will say, well, there's absolutely no way I'm going to lend you that money because it's entirely unpredictable because of the electricity price volatility. So what that means in reality is that it's impossible to get renewable energy developments off the ground unless there is a mechanism that provides some degree of price stability. And so the reason for saying that is that the support, when people talk about the support mechanisms that are out there for renewables, they often talk about subsidy. And yes, subsidy is important, but subsidy is not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient. We'll come back to subsidy. But you also need price stability. And so what that means is you need some mechanism that will stabilize over the long term the price at which a generator is able to sell its electricity in order for that generator to raise the finance to get the development off the ground. And the point of emphasizing that, and I can't overemphasize this, is that when renewable energy developments don't occur because of economic concerns, it's typically not the renewable energy developer that is making the decision to not proceed. As I said earlier, there's lots of entrepreneurial ones out there that are quite happy to take risks, who actually in many cases wouldn't care if they make a bundle of money out of it. They're often in it to save the planet, literally. However, they can't go ahead without raising the financing to do that. So it's the decisions of the finance sector, typically, that are the ones that make that decide about whether the developments are going ahead or not. All of which is to say that the book is about electricity, but it's just as much about finance as it is about electricity. So the main mechanism that has, and this speaks to your question about the nature of this, why you need support mechanisms. The main mechanism historically in Europe, at least, that has provided that price stability is the so-called feed-in tariff. And in the UK today, you have something called contracts for difference, which is, it's not a feed-in tariff, but it's very much like it. We don't need to get into the details of the differences. And what that is where literally the government or a government-backed entity essentially says to a developer, we pledge to buy all your electrical output for, say, 12 years at a fixed price over that period. The developer then takes that promise, goes back to the bank, knocks on the door and says, look, Mr. or Mrs. Banker, here you have proof of how much I'm going to be able to sell the electricity for. Now give me the debt. And the banks will say, absolutely fine, we can finance it at that electricity price. So people often think about feed-in tariffs and other mechanisms as things that are there to support energy developers. Actually, they're there to support banks. So that's the argument of volatility. The other argument, which is the one that people have focused on more, but I think the volatility argument is just as important. The other argument is not only is profitability in the renewables business very uncertain, very volatile, it's also quite low. So again, it varies hugely, of course, across time and space in relation to all sorts of things, like the nature of government support is very important to this. But most studies suggest that on average over time, you're looking at returns of maybe 5 to 8%, something in that region. And the thing that I always say here, and I think it's really important to emphasize, is that it's only really relevant to think about profitability and returns in a relative perspective rather than an absolute perspective. And what I mean by that is whoever you are as a capitalist actor, you always have alternative investment opportunities available to you. And so you will always, at one level, be thinking about the potential returns available relative to other investment opportunities. And so I'll give you two kind of important kind of relative points to think about that I think will help people think about this in a useful way. So the first of those is a very simple point, which is that 5 to 8% returns looked pretty attractive 3 or 4 years ago when interest rates were zero around the world. 5 to 8% look great. If you get 5 to 8%, that's pretty cool. But today, when interest rates are like 5%, and you can get 5% or more at no effort and no risk by putting your money in the bank or buying US government bonds and getting 6 or 7% return, why would you go to the trouble and hassle of all that work and risk of developing a wind farm just to get the same amount of return? So that's one kind of counterpoint to think about in terms of the relativity of returns. The other one is, let's think about one of the most important constituencies that policymakers have been kind of hoping would lead the renewables charge, which is the big oil and gas companies, the BPs and the Exxons and so on. Well, over the last 10 years or so, they haven't got out of bed for projects that deliver anything less than 15% plus returns in their core upstream oil and gas exploration and production business. So the idea that they would willingly say, okay, we're going to take money from out of our traditional business and move into renewables where returns are kind of 5 to 8% is actually kind of absurd when you think about it from a pure economic rationality perspective. It makes no sense for them to do that. And here's the kicker: for as long as they think that those much higher returns will continue to be available in their core business. And I think that's the key thing, right, is that if you go back to sort of 2018-19, my reading of what was going on then was that the European oil and gas companies, at least, were kind of worried that governments were going to take the type of action that would be necessary to diminish those returns through things like carbon taxes and so on. But I think what governments have shown, unfortunately, over the last 4 or 5 years, is they're not willing to do that. They are handing out new licenses for oil and gas exploration and production willy-nilly around the world, including in the UK, but not only there. And I think the BPs and so on have simply said, well, look, these governments aren't serious. They're not going to do anything anytime soon to so-called strand our traditional assets, mean that we can't exploit them in a profitable way. And they've kind of said, well, fuck it, we'll stick with our core business because governments have shown that we're going to be able to continue to do that for as long as we like, essentially. And so having talked a reasonable talk about transitioning, the BPs and the Shells and the Totals have kind of backtracked and said, no, we're just going to stick to our traditional business. And as for the US ones, they never even pretended in the first place that they were serious about going down that road. So returns is a relative thing. So that raises the kind of important question of, hang on a second, well, why is this a relatively low returns business? And that's, I mean, a lot of the book is given over to trying to explain that. I think that I would rather than trying to give a comprehensive explanation for it, I'll focus on two or three things that contribute to that help us understand that. And so the first of those is actually again quite a simple issue, and it's the issue of competition. So remember when your first question, I think it was, or second question, that you asked about what's happened to the electricity sector. And remember, we talked about how it's been unbundled from being vertically integrated to being kind of broken up into its different constituent parts. And so what that means in terms of the stuff that's relevant here is that today you typically have a kind of self-standing generation sector. You have companies that focus specifically on electricity generation. And that sector, and in particular the part of it that is focused on renewables, is incredibly competitive. It's very, very competitive. There's thousands of electricity generators, and they selling their electricity into very competitive wholesale markets. And here's the thing, too, which is the fact that because governments very understandably want consumers to have as low electricity prices as possible, they have designed those electricity markets and they've designed their support mechanisms for renewables in such a way as to kind of exacerbate and intensify competition on price. So competition on price. So now let's imagine that you are a wind farm operator and you've been in business for like 20 years and you've seen the cost of generating electricity from wind plummet over time. Intuitively, you would think, well, the cost of generation has come down now. My profits are going up. But of course, that's only true if you have the kind of market power, to use an economic terminology, or the capacity to capture the gains associated with those cost reductions. But if you're operating in a really competitive sector, that's simply not possible because those growing cost efficiencies simply get competed away under the force of competition. And essentially, in kind of graphic terms, those growing cost efficiencies get passed downstream to subsequent parts of the supply chain. They get passed downstream to transmission operators, distribution companies, retailers, and ultimately, in significant part, consumers, because that's precisely what policymakers want. They want those gains to be passed on rather than to be captured by nasty capitalist actors in the electricity generation sector, right? And so that competition is a really important issue, which is to say that it's very hard for renewables generators to capture the gains associated with improving cost efficiencies because of that competition. And and one way I like to put this is to say, in very simplistic terms, is to say there's no OPEC in electricity generation. Like in the oil and gas business, amongst other things, OPEC is there to keep prices and profitability up worldwide. And as soon as it thinks that there's going to be a glut of oil and gas production, it tells its members to cut back on production to keep prices and profits up. There's nothing like that in electricity. Maybe there should be an OPEC in electricity generation, but there isn't. There's nothing to stop what Marx called like the coercive force of competition from competing those profits away and having them passed downstream. So that's the first thing. Very, very important to understand. And just as as one example of that, if you think about how those feed-in tariffs are awarded in the UK, it's through auctions where basically generating companies bid against each other and they bid prices down to as low as they can go before it gets to the point where there's no profitability left, and they can't go any lower. So as I say, governments have designed mechanisms such a way as to kind of exacerbate that competition.
We had some failed auctions in the UK recently where sort of no one bid.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's worth talking about that story because it's very, very instructive. So instructive, not least in kind of showing the buffoonery of the UK government on these things. So,
and most things.
Yeah, well, yes, maybe. So the way that works is that, as I said earlier, a feed-in tariff is basically where the generator gets promised a certain price that their electricity will be bought for over the long time. And as I say, those contracts are awarded at auction, and essentially what happens is generators, developers bid against each other, where essentially what happens is one will say, okay, I'll bid £50 per megawatt hour to sell my electricity for 12. Another one says, well, I'll do it for 49. Another one says, I'll do 48. So it's like a reverse auction. It's the opposite of the traditional auction format. Instead of bidding prices up, they bid prices down. And they'll go down until it gets to the point where they can't go any lower because it simply would not make economic sense for them to do that, and they wouldn't be able to raise the financing to do that because, as I said earlier, the bank will say, well, you're not going to make any money. And it will go to... And so what's happened is, over the years, because the generating costs of renewables have come down, those bidders at those auctions have been able to go lower and lower and lower with their bids. Like 10 years ago, it might have been, I don't know, £80 per megawatt hour as the strike price at the auction. 5 years later, 60, 5 years later, 50 or whatever. And the government, in its wisdom, said, look, this is awesome. The prices are going down, great deal for consumers. We will impose a ceiling price at the auction at which we will not accept any bids above that level. And look, the price has been going down, so we're going to set the ceiling price like at that level. So because there's no reason that prices should go up again, is there? But what happened, of course, is that over the last couple of years, lots of the costs that renewables developers incur, particularly the technology cost, buying the turbines, for example, in the case of offshore wind because of steel prices, and the cost of financing, with interest rates having gone from 0 to 5%, their prices have gone up. So they said to the government, look, if you impose that ceiling price, we're not going to be able to bid because our costs have gone up. So we need a higher ceiling price or else we're not going to be able to make any money. And the government basically, as my understanding has it, thought they were kind of bluffing and thought that they were, bluffing in the service of kind of getting outsized profits. But they weren't bluffing. They were completely telling the truth. And so when the auction came, there were no bids because no one thought they could make money at that ceiling price. So the government completely messed up.
It's okay, you can swear.
Yeah. I realised I did already and I didn't want to do it again.
Yeah, cat's out of the bag.
So it was a classic case of incompetence in government. The industry wasn't bluffing. They were telling the truth. So competition, that competition is kind of embedded in that process. So that's one thing. Two other things I'll talk about quickly because I don't want to get too much into the... But it's important, isn't it? And it's interesting. So the first of those two other things, and I love this one simply because I'm a geographer, and so it's a geographical issue. So of course I love it. So let's go back again to something we said earlier, which is when you look at your bill as a consumer of electricity, you are paying the price that you're paying for electricity to be generated, and you're paying for electricity to be transported from where it's produced to where you live, and we often forget the latter and we focus on the former. And in fact, those charts that everyone talks about, cheap renewables, what's being measured there is just the price of generating the electricity. So it's all the costs involved in being able to produce the electricity. Buying the technology, leasing and buying the land, all that sort of stuff. It doesn't typically include, it doesn't even normally include kind of grid connection, and it certainly doesn't include the cost of transporting it. Now, the geographical thing is this, which is to say whichever country you happen to look at in the world, and this is true of the UK, it's true in the US, it's true in China, Japan, India, Germany, everywhere, there's a consistent feature that's remarkably repeated across country and country, which is that wind and solar facilities are disproportionately located where people in industry are not located. So in the UK, for example, industry and in particular consumers are based predominantly in the southeast. That's the centre, and wind farms in particular, also solar, but particularly wind are based right up in the north of Scotland. And in the UK's case, there are actually some physical reasons for that in terms of wind speeds and so on. But in Sweden, for example, where I live, it's the same pattern. Very, very predominantly people living in the south and industry in the south, and all the renewable power is up in the north. There are various reasons for that, but far and away the most important reason for it across territories is that it's land costs. So unlike conventional power plants, solar and wind farms, big ones, take huge amounts of land. And therefore, renewables developers are hugely sensitive to land costs. And all other things being equal, they will always try to locate their facilities where land is relatively cheap rather than where it's expensive. So in the US, for example, I think I read data saying that the average cost of land in Wyoming is like 1% of the average cost of land in New Jersey. So of course they're going to base themselves in Wyoming rather than in New Jersey. But what that means is that because renewable power on average is much further located away from where demand is located than conventional power plants are, those renewables facilities exert a disproportionate burden on the transmission grid because they're further away, so they have much greater transportation requirements. And again, as I said earlier, grid operators try to charge different entities, including generators, according to the demands that they exert on the grid. And so another way of saying that is to say that they attempt to make renewable energy developers and other generating companies bear the costs of their locational decisions. So the further away they locate from centres of demand, the higher their transmission charges are going to be. And as I said, those transmission charges aren't included in those charts showing low costs. And so the way I like to think about this is that, like, you can't have your cake and eat it. If you are a renewable energy developer, you can either have very, very low generating costs, which is including a very low land cost, and very high transportation costs, or if you're happy to locate like very, very close to London, for example, where we are today, you're going to have astronomical generating costs and very, very low transportation costs. But you can't have low on both sides. So that cheap renewables is a completely artificial figure because it's dependent upon high transportation costs. And so the idea that renewables are cheap is actually a complete fallacy. They're only cheap if you focus specifically on generating costs because you're ignoring commensurately high transportation costs. And that's why the business that you would think would be really profitable because it's got low generating costs isn't profitable because you've got very, very, very high transportation costs. So that's the second thing I want to talk about is the geography of it is really important. And then very, very briefly, as well as the geography of it being important, the temporality of it is important. And what I mean by that is that, to take an example, so let's assume for the sake of argument that you have a conventional power plant burning natural gas, and then you have a wind farm, and let's assume for the sake of argument that they actually have exactly the same costs, total costs, all costs included, and that over a particular period of, say, a week or a month or whatever it is, that they generate exactly the same amount of power and that they are able to sell exactly the same amount of power. You would intuitively think, well, they make exactly the same amount of profit, right? They've got the same costs, got the same product that they're creating and selling. They must make the same profit. But no, that's completely fallacious assumption. The reason it's fallacious is that their ability to generate revenue from that sale will depend on the output profile of their electricity. So at what times of the day and week or month are they producing that electricity? Is it at times of the day or week or month when electricity is relatively abundant and cheap? Or is it at times of the day or month when electricity is in high demand and in short supply and very, very expensive? And the thing is that for renewables generators, on average, all other things being equal, they tend to produce their electricity at times where electricity has much lower revenue potential than conventional power plants. So again, that production profile is very, very significant to think about here. So even if they have these very low costs are kind of for nothing if you also have low revenue potential. So all of those things plus the various other factors all feed in to create a business which, as I said earlier, just does not generate very high returns on average, which means that all other things being equal, capital is simply not particularly attracted to it.
Very complicated, very well explained. If I were to try and sort of summarize it, it feels a little bit like this sort of absurd situation where, for whatever reason, ideology, I don't know, just kind of an incumbent assumption that markets are the way to do things, that, you know, we want to use the price signal, but actually, you know, we can't take the market price, and we want to rely on profits, but actually profit's a problem here, and we want competition because we love competition, but actually that's also a problem. And it just feels like this effort to wedge a market into a place where it absolutely kind of doesn't belong. And it feels a bit like, what's the point? And one of the things that you reference in your book that I think is so interesting that captures this is you actually refer to Karl Polanyi.
Yes.
And you mentioned this idea of a false commodity and the idea that maybe electricity could fit into that category. So could you just talk us through, you know, what that kind of means and why you think maybe electricity fits that definition?
So he was many things, but amongst others, an economic anthropologist that many people might have heard of. And he had this idea of what he called fictitious commodities, and the three he talked about were land, labor, and capital, where basically he said, look, these aren't real commodities. Real commodities are things that were kind of made for sale on the market in the first place. Mobile phones, microphones, those sorts of things. And he said, basically, land, labor, and capital are different. They weren't created for sale on the market. And he said, what happens when you try to manufacture markets for the circulation of those fictitious commodities is that it never really works very well. You encounter all sorts of kind of negative symptoms when you try to do that, and you kind of end up requiring all manner of kind of social regulations and norms to enable the perpetuation of the facade that what you actually have is a commodity in the first place. And you can think about that in relation to labour markets and financial markets and land markets. They're kind of surrounded by social norms and regulations that are essentially there to help us maintain that facade. And I argue that electricity is very much the same thing. And actually, when you look at them, remember we've been talking about those wholesale markets and retail markets, the more you look at them, the more you realise that they're a million miles away from what people might think of as free markets. They're completely surrounded by and kind of buttressed by all manner of regulatory interventions of various kind, because without those, they would literally fall apart. And there's an American author, I think her name's Meredith Angwin. She basically poo-poos the idea that that you should even think about these as markets. I think she calls them bureaucratic thickets, because they are literally thickets, and you have to kind of go through the regulatory weeds to even understand how they're structured in the first place. And so that's exactly right. So I think we've got ourselves in this position where we're kind of desperately trying to maintain the facade that what we really have here are markets and real profits, when actually all of these things are just regulatory constructs. If profits fall too low, regulators scramble to try to maintain them at such a level that you'll have investment. If they get too high, regulators scramble to kind of impose windfall tax because you'll get public outcry on the other hand. So they're trying to kind of keep profits in this kind of zone of reasonableness. And it's all about regulatory invention in one way or another. So I think it's a nice way to think about electricity as being this kind of fictitious commodity.
You mentioned earlier China and how they are doing things very differently, and probably are the kind of actual success story when we think about building out renewables. So can you talk about how they're doing it, and is it not sort of a market-based approach? So
China's super interesting and super important. And just to kind of signal its importance, you could look at data for, say, 2023, so for last year, when there was great kind of joy and celebration in the fact that there was huge growth in renewables investment worldwide last year, and everyone said, "Oh, that we're off to the races. We're winning. It's all about price and markets are winning it. Despite reservations." But if you actually looked at the data for what happened in 2023, 80% of the increment, so 80% of the extra growth in 2023 versus 2022 was in China. So basically, China was responsible for almost all the growth, and the rest of the world hardly advanced at all. So China absolutely, for now and in recent years, is the success story. It's consistently been installing around 50% of new global capacity of renewables each year over the last 4 or 5 years, while the rest of the world is simply not doing very well. Having said that, as many people will know, China is also the main developer of new coal-fired power plants. So let's not be under any illusions that China is doing everything wonderfully on the environmental front. And obviously, so it's kind of winning on both dirty and clean, so to speak. But for sure, it's doing very, very well on the clean front. And I think that it's a complicated thing to understand. And obviously, for me as kind of a Western observer, I'm relying on the reporting principally of kind of Western energy experts who have spent a lot of time in China. But my understanding, at least, is that, well, what's clear is that contra to that story I told earlier about the reliance on the private sector, is that that's not true in China. So in the wind sector, for example, I think the figure is 95% of wind sector development is in the hand of state-owned enterprises, and it's something similar in the solar sector. So it's state-owned companies who are financed by state-owned banks who are providing loans that are subsidized by the state-owned central bank. So it's essentially entirely being done by state-owned enterprises. Now, there is a question, and a very legitimate question, about the extent to which those entities are, A, driven by the profit motive, and B, operating in what we think of as kind of markets, notwithstanding the reservations I just raised about that term in this context. My understanding is that, from everything that I've read, is that the profit motive, to the extent that it's playing a role here, is relatively limited. That what these state-owned enterprises in renewables are doing is much more about being directed by state authorities, both centrally in Beijing and at the provincial level. So provincial authorities play a very, very important role here, and it's also clear that they don't necessarily align, so that what provincial authorities are doing is not necessarily in alignment with what Beijing wants and is doing. But be that as it may, this is in significant part a state-directed enterprise, which the state can do because it has the capacity and the determination to do that, which is simply not available, for now at least, in most Western nations, precisely because we've gone through this historic process of privatization, where the energy sector is simply not within state hands any longer, for the most part, with some exceptions. France being, for example, a notable one, where EDF essentially controls the electricity sector and is a state-owned enterprise. And
is that, I guess, a solution that you would take from, I mean, not necessarily replicating the Chinese model exactly, but, if markets aren't working, and if your argument is that probably they can't work absent, a huge amount of state support and intervention to kind of stabilize and boost profitability, is the answer that we just sort of stop bothering trying to rely on markets to do this, and we look at, alternatives like returning to public ownership of energy? What would be your prescription, I guess, just to put you on the spot a little bit? But
yeah, I'll be honest and say I'm not really sure I have a prescription. But I think, I have some sympathies in some arguments more than others, but I'm also a realist, for better or for worse, which means that I can't help but think about different options, both in terms of their kind of desirability, but also their likely feasibility. But with that said, I mean, I think there are three main sort of options out there that get talked about by those who recognise that we have problems. I mean, as you said earlier, lots of people don't. Lots of people believe that argument that levelised cost of energy has come down, we're off to the races, charts going up, it was all well and good. The only problems are like slow permitting and slow grid connections and NIMBYism and, you know, all that sort of good stuff. And of course, all that stuff's relevant, but it's really not. It's really not the only set of issues, or even the most important set of issues. But there are clearly individuals and institutions who recognise that we do have some fundamental economic problems, even if they don't capture it in the terms that I specifically have captured it. They kind of, to one extent or another, they know that this is an issue. And actually, one of the things that's been interesting talking to people about the book is that in the energy sector and in the energy finance sector, absolutely people know this is an issue, but they find it hard to talk about it because people don't like them talking about it. Which is instructive in and of itself, but absolutely there. So to the extent that people know we have problems, what are the three kind of solutions out there? Well, the first is the one you just is when you were in your question, you mentioned, you know, subsidy. So if you listen to the industry itself, what they will say is, look, the problem's not that, of course they say this, the problem's not that we're relying on the private sector and markets to get us there in terms of decarbonisation. The problem is simply that we don't have enough subsidy. So that and so they'll basically say, look, insofar as you know, current levels of profits are not proving enough to attract enough investment into the sector, we need more and better subsidy and stability. And that's what the Inflation Reduction Act was, essentially, in the US. So the energy sector had been saying to the Biden administration, and before that the Trump administration, look, you've been reducing the tax credits that you provide to subsidize renewables, and look what happens, investment stagnates. You need to lift the tax credits back up to where they were originally, and the investment will flow back in, because by lifting those credits, what you are effectively doing is reinflating profitability. Whether that's going to work or not, the jury's still out. We don't quite know yet because we don't have the data. But that's what it was all about. So that was the government responding to industry. That was the industry's answer. The second answer, and I have some sympathy with that argument. It's like, you know, these are capitalist actors, and if we're going to rely on capitalists to do that, when we may as well understand how they operate, which is that they require profitability to invest, given alternative investment opportunities. The second answer that's out there is a somewhat different one, and this is the answer you'll hear from the type of people that you looked at in your book, The Value of a Whale, which is, for want of a better description, kind of orthodox economists focused on energy, many of whom also recognise that there's a problem, but absolutely wouldn't posit it in the terms that I posit it. And so what they would say, I think, they would say that it's not that we're relying on private sector and markets that's the problem. The problem is of two possible types. So one is in the nature of the market. So what they would say is the problem is that we haven't got the market design right. So what they're arguing there is that you just have to tinker with the way in which you construct wholesale and retail markets, and then things will flow from there. And I have a degree of sympathy with that argument too, because what they rightfully say is that electricity markets, as I described them earlier, were markets that were designed in a very different world. They were designed in and for a fossil fuel world, and we now live in a different world, an increasingly different world. So we need to reform electricity markets to make them more appropriate for the current and future supply mix. And they say if we do that, things will fall into place. I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm not convinced by it, because economists always say that. They always say it's about market design. And, you know, there's lots of suggestions for market redesign out there, and none of them are particularly compelling. They all have potential advantages, but they also all have drawbacks. There is no perfect market design because it's a fictitious commodity. And the other thing they would say is we just need to get the price right. And what they mean, and of course, what they mean by that, and I have some sympathy here too, is they say, well, look, the problem, we can't just look at the greens, what we're doing in terms of renewable subsidies. We also have to think about, well, the other way to make renewables more competitive, as well as subsidising them, is to tax the dirty side, carbon taxes. It's to put a price on carbon that is currently an unpriced externality. So that's the argument they make there. And again, I have some sympathy with that. But the problem there, of course, is that insofar as we, not least in Western societies, live very carbon-intensive lifestyles, carbon's everywhere in our products, in our services, in our travel, and so on. And given concerns around inflation, they are very, very reluctant to have a tax on carbon that would be felt by consumers, whether at the petrol pump or in buying plastics or whatever else it might be. So I think that I totally think that there's an intellectual logic to that argument about carbon taxes, but there's lots of political obstacles that I think explain why historically, in order to improve the competitiveness of renewables, governments have focused on making renewables cheaper rather than making the fossil fuel side of the equation more expensive. That makes sense. That's the second answer. The third answer is the one that you kind of started with, which is to say, look, markets and our reliance on markets in the private sector is the problem. We've been relying on them since day one to do this. It's still not going fast enough, remotely fast enough, despite the fact that support for renewables remains ubiquitous across the world. Despite the fact that the prices have come down, it's still going too slowly. So maybe we should try something else. And the something else that is typically discussed, there's also discussions around, distributed energy, community, local energy production. But the main option that is being discussed or has been discussed, particularly on the left, would be much greater level public ownership. So instead of governments financing by providing subsidy to private sector development, government would finance the whole kit and caboodle for public sector ownership and generation. And to me, there's a very strong logic to that. I think in general, certainly in rich countries, of which the UK is one, it's seen in a global perspective, governments can finance that type of investment more cheaply, typically, than the private sector can. I think that and it's not like you would be borrowing to invest in things that are not generating a return. You're borrowing to invest in revenue-generating assets, and 5 to 8% returns might not be good enough for the private sector, but it should certainly be good enough for the public sector. So I think there's a lot of credibility to that argument, and I think that also it's worth pointing out that there are all sorts of other arguments in favour of public sector ownership around things like the ability to plan and coordinate. I mean, the energy transition is nothing if not a kind of unwieldy, multifaceted, complex transition that has innumerable moving parts. And the idea that kind of far-flung autonomous private actors are going to make decisions that kind of add up to that transition, a bit unconvincing, whereas the state has that ability to coordinate and plan at a kind of macro level that I think makes public ownership also appealing from that kind of coordination perspective as well. Of course, the problem is that we live in a world where governments have, in places like the UK, but not only in the UK, have persuaded themselves or allowed themselves to be persuaded that that's something that government shouldn't be doing. You shouldn't be splurging on that type of investment. We have massive problems with government budget deficits and so on, and that simply that's not something we are in a position to do. I mean, my own sense is that, without being an expert on government on public finance, is that in countries like the UK and the US and Germany and so on, which are in the big scheme of things rich countries, governments have much greater capacity than they might imagine or that they say to undertake that type of large-scale public investment and public ownership. in investment in revenue generating assets like renewables assets. However, I think it's fair to say that it would be another thing entirely for poorer country governments to undertake that type of borrowing and investment, insofar as the fact that they operate under vastly more severe fiscal constraints. They're already operating under crippling debt servicing burdens as it is in many cases, and the idea that sort of kind of big public investment would be feasible in other parts of the world is a different matter. And so I think public sector ownership is definitely an option, but we need to think about why, what's the specific rationale for it, and also we need to think about the degree of how credible it might be in one place or another around the world. But it's definitely another thing that people are thinking about and talking about, and I have a lot of sympathy for that argument as well. But
if public sector ownership is, for the reasons you just outlined there, not really an option for, a lower income country, then, is private sector investment all that much more likely, because it feels like the same constraints around uncertainty and volatility and low profitability, all of those would still apply.
No, I mean, and it's not. And here's the I mean, without wanting to kind of depress viewers, I mean, the problem, as I said, the main problem is that the parts of the world where investment in power sector decarbonisation is most urgent and necessary from an environmental perspective are precisely the parts of the world where the economic and financial challenges are greatest. And so I'm thinking about India, Nigeria, Indonesia, where frankly it's far more important that those power sectors get investment than, say, Sweden, for two main reasons, and it's important to be clear about those reasons. One is the fact that in countries like Sweden, you're already much further down the road of decarbonisation as it is. 90% of electricity generation in Sweden is fossil free already, whereas in South Africa, 90% is through coal generation right now. So that's where existing electricity is dirtiest, and so you need to get it decarbonised as quickly as possible. But also, it's in those parts of the world, on average, that future growth in energy demand is expected to be concentrated, which makes it doubly important that you invest in decarbonisation in those countries. And so, it's not really what happens in Europe and North America that is going to have the biggest impact on future global power sector emissions trajectories. It's going to be what happens absolutely in China and India and South Africa and Nigeria and Indonesia and so on. But if you look at the financing costs in those parts of the world, they're orders of magnitude higher than they are in the global north. So you might be able to borrow, say, at 4% to develop a wind farm, borrow at 4% from a private sector bank to develop a wind farm in the Netherlands, but it will cost you 12% in Senegal. And so it's not surprising that development is not happening in those parts of the world, because the risk perception on the part of private financiers is so much greater, which is not to say the risk reality is much greater. It might be, but it's the perception of risk that matters. And if it's perceived to be a risky investment, then the cost of capital is higher accordingly. So those developments are only really happening right now in the global south. They're not happening through sovereign governments financing them and public ownership. They are happening through private investment, but they're only happening where that private investment is kind of subsidized by quasi-public finance from things like development finance institutions like the World Bank and so on, or philanthropic institutions who will come in and say to the private sector lenders, look, we know you have this perception of risk, so we will bear that risk for you. And if there are losses, we'll take them onto our balance sheet rather than you having to do that. And again, it's politically unsatisfactory, it's politically galling, but it's completely understandable from an economic and financial perspective. And there's just not enough of that development finance on a big enough scale to drive the power sector decarbonisation that we need in the global south.
That actually, I think, brings me quite naturally to my last question for you, which is, the subtitle of your book is Why Capitalism Won't Solve the Climate Crisis. But the book itself is like much more narrowly focused on electricity markets and questions there.
It is.
Without putting you in the hot seat too much, do you stand by that broader thesis? And, a lot of what you just talked about in that answer there about, it all makes sense from the perspective of economic and financial actors. Is that in and of itself the problem, is that we're operating within a framework that is fundamentally ill-suited to this challenge?
Yeah, it's people often ask that question, and unfortunately I don't have the kind of intellectual capacity to answer that. It's such a huge question that I don't have a good answer to that question, and I'd be speculating unduly to kind of posit an answer to that question. But my suspicion is that the answer is yes. If we more or less globally stick with the existing political economic constellations that we have, then it seems to me that it's very hard to be positive about where we're heading, because I'm a great believer in listening to what history the last 20 years or so shows that despite growing awareness of all the problems, we're not really changing course fast enough, anywhere near fast enough. So I find it hard to be positive. However, it strikes me that, having said that, the likelihood of major kind of change of direction in terms of overall political economy is feels so distant and so limited that I have to believe that we can make much more rapid progress without a significant shift of things. And so, if push comes to the shove, if I was put on the spot, if the choice is on the one hand, government's basically just saying, look, we'll provide as much support and stability as you need to bring forth the necessary private sector investment to decarbonise much more rapidly, and massive profits for capital, or government's not providing that subsidy and support and the necessary investment not occurring, I'll take option A every time. But obviously it's an unsatisfactory dilemma, right? It's an unsatisfactory choice, and one would hope that there's a broader palette of options. But if that's the choice, and right now it feels kind of like it is, then I'll take option A every time. And so for that reason alone, I think I'm a great supporter of things like the Inflation Reduction Act.
All right. Well, on that cheery note, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Brett, for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.